Greetings, dear viewers, ladies and gentlemen. This is our dialogue, which deals with current issues unfolding in Ethiopia and on the continent of Africa. In this edition of our dialogue, we'll be talking about the 60th anniversary of the OAU, the implications and the way forward. And my guest today is the one and only Ambassador Dr. Arikana Chihombori-Quao. She's the former AU ambassador to the United States of America. She's also the founder and president of Africa Diaspora Development Institute. She's a great Pan-Africanist, and as such, she's been traveling to different parts of Africa and the whole world. With the program, I'm Shifaralak. Do stay with us. Ambassador, thank you so much for making the time to talk to us. It's really good to see you again.
Thank you for having me. Keep up the good work.
Thank you, Ambassador. As you know, the African Union and its member states have commemorated the 60th anniversary of the then OAU, current AU. Leaders of the countries on the continent have raised pertinent issues, the challenges, the success stories. So let's first dwell on some of the success stories. They have hammered home a number of success stories this continent of Africa has achieved. So what have you made out of the speeches that the leaders, heads of states made, Ambassador?
I think the one I've enjoyed the most recently is the one from President Ruto of Kenya, where he addressed that issue of the heads of states being called, all of them, by one head of state, and they ran off to the United States and they ran off to China. They were getting ready to run off to Japan, run off to France. It's ridiculous. It's treating these heads of states like they're children. So for them to stand up and say enough is enough, it was just beautiful listening to President Ruto take a position to say the heads of states have decided that they're going to send a delegation, because it makes sense to me that if the president of Japan wants to address the African leaders, let him come to the African Union and address them. If the president of the United States, China, if all these world leaders want to address African leaders, let them come to the African Union. But having all the heads of states run off to see one president, it is a joke, it is ridiculous, it is disrespectful, and I'm glad to hear, and it was beautiful just really listening to President Ruto call it like it is.
One of the things this anniversary puts on the spotlight, Ambassador, is how Africa has been, resilient all these years in the face of diverse challenges and issues. This continent has been registering remarkable success stories, amazing stories, despite the pressures from within and without. So I want to ask you this question. Where is Africa now in terms of the visions of the founding fathers of the OAU?
We have not moved very much. We have moved, but not to the extent that we should. Keep in mind, they met in 1963 to discuss the possibility of creating an Africa that spoke with one voice. The Casablanca group lost. We often say, when the Casablanca group lost, Africa lost. The nationalists, who were the Monrovia group, they said, let's go slow. We have been going slow ever since. What was needed since 1963 was the creation of an Africa that was borderless, an Africa that spoke with one voice, an Africa that has a single military, an Africa with a single currency, single stock exchange, single monetary policy, single trade policy. Of all those, we've only finally, in the past couple of years, accomplished the trade policy. And even that, its implementation is a monster because of some underlying issues that if it is to succeed, and I'm talking about the Continental Free Trade Area, if the Continental Free Trade Area is to succeed, two things, in my opinion, must be in place. One, free movement of people. How do we talk about free trade when we still need visas, when we still have these borders? How do we talk about free trade when we have how many different currencies? 40-something different currencies. We need our own single African currency as a must. We need a borderless Africa. Those two things must be put in place if we are going to have a resounding African Continental Free Trade Area that is successful, that is going to have the desired results. As is, it's still, in my opinion, ridiculous that we can talk about at the AU an Africa that speaks with one voice, and yet you have countries like South Africa strengthening their borders and limiting the number of Africans that can come to South Africa. I still need visa to go to Nigeria, to go to a lot of countries in Africa. How can we be talking from two corners of our mouth? Either we have an Africa that is truly committed to true change, free movement of people is a must, a single currency is a must. I know it is a monster trying to navigate those terrain, but those are the building blocks that are going to lead to a successful trade policy. It is ridiculous that we're still sitting at around 15 to 20% intra-Africa trade. Something must be done to improve intra-Africa trade first by simply loosening a few borders and making sure that we have a monetary policy that is responsive and of benefit to the African people.
Well, that's great insight, Ambassador. Indeed, there are diverse issues that this continent of Africa is still grappling with. We'll come to that later on, Ambassador. And on a brighter note, addressing the gathering of at the AU headquarters on Thursday, the leaders tried to hammer home the fact that it's bright on the other side of Africa. And as such, there is no room to be pessimistic. So as a Pan-Africanist, Ambassador, what are some of the ways that you see for Africa to capitalize on the positive trajectory?
You take, for example, the two biggest areas that can turn Africa upside down overnight are agriculture and mining. Our natural resources alone, we do not need to be going to the IMF or World Bank for loans. We have people who are picking up chunks of gold, chunks of lithium, chunks of precious minerals. If they were to be properly channeled, Africa does not need the World Bank. Africa does not need IMF. Agriculture, we still have the largest quantities of arable land. Over 65% of the world arable land is in Africa. You take the situation in Ukraine, a tiny little country like that. Look at how much Ukraine is providing, is importing to Africa. We don't need wheat from Ukraine. This is an opportunity for us to be totally self-sufficient. I was talking to a brother from North Africa, and he said, Ambassador, we would love to get all our agricultural products out of sub-Saharan Africa, but the logistics of getting the products from sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa are so difficult that it is easier for them to get their wheat from Ohio in the United States. So we got work to do as Africans. Logistics alone are keeping us from having the effective intra-Africa trade that we need. So we have some serious low-hanging fruits that we need to address as a matter of agency. I think it is ridiculous that North Africa should have to procure its wheat from the United States, from Ukraine. A lot of African countries, I was shocked at the figures of the numbers of African countries that are getting their wheat out of Ukraine. I am shocked at the numbers of African countries that are importing chickens. Mozambique is importing 92% of their chickens. Ghana, 72%. Zimbabwe, I thought they were doing better. Over 50% of their chickens are imported. Chickens alone are by far the most consumed meat on earth, and no other meat comes even close. African economy could be turned around by chickens. So there are some very low-hanging fruits that we could look at. Agriculture and mining are the two areas that if we focused on, Africa does not need to borrow money from the IMF or the World Bank. We can be completely self-sufficient.
Africa is rich. Africa is prosperous. However, there are various issues that make this great continent of Africa not be able to properly make the best out of its riches, dealing with diverse problems, making it not only fragile, but also potential battleground for foreigners with diverse geopolitical interests. And this is a huge assignment that Africa has to do. So what are some of the ways out that you see for Africa?
That is actually a very great question that goes to the core of why Africa is where Africa is today and why Africa struggles to pull, quote unquote, by herself by the bootstraps. Let me use, for example, the situation in Sudan. People must understand that Sudan, just like many African countries, has been under siege for a very long time. Well, let's go back to 1989, when then General Bashir had a coup and overthrew the civilian government. He stayed in power for 10 years. He was then also overthrown in a coup by two more generals, who then turned around in 2021, did their own coup against an entity that they created, which is totally ridiculous. And now the other general is wanting to overthrow his own partner, who was his partner in crime, in overthrowing President Bashir and their own entity that they put together in 2021. It would seem that one would think that it is about the two generals. The world news, the CNNs of this world, the BBCs, they try to say it is about the two generals. It is fifth line down the road about the generals, who in this case, it looks like they're basically greedy, two greedy people. And I have a message for both of them to say, whichever one of you wins and ends up being the leader of Sudan, your day of reckoning is also coming, because there's going to be yet another general who's going to come in and overthrow you. The question then is, to the African individuals, if you truly care about the children of Sudan, if you care about the people of Sudan, you should not be fighting with your brother. What these two generals are doing is ridiculous. You came together to overthrow your own entity that you put together. You came together to overthrow President Bashir. How long is this nonsense going to stop? You all came together and you decided to split Sudan into North and South Sudan. Sudan has been under siege for a long time. What is the interest in Sudan? If the two generals could stop being funded, the war would end. The question then becomes, who is funding the two generals? If you want to understand Africa, follow the money, follow the guns. Sudan is a very rich country. Second largest producer of gold in Africa. It has large oil reserves, very rich soil for agriculture. Its access to the Red Sea, its access to the Suez Canal makes it attractive for those countries that want bases in the Horn of Africa. So now it becomes a competition to say who can get to Sudan first, depending on their interest. It's not about the people of Sudan. It is not about the two generals. The two generals are being used to further somebody else's agenda. The two generals are being used by the hidden hand that is forever present, destabilizing not only Sudan, but every African country. So when we begin to understand the invisible hand, then it will be easier for us to refuse to be used. The two generals, they have got to stop behaving like children. They have got to stop being used by others who have other interests in Sudan. They think they are fighting for the people of Sudan. No, they are not. Their behavior has been deplorable. It's unacceptable that they can hate the Sudanese people to this extent. The suffering of the Sudanese people has been going on for far too long. If those two generals truly, truly cared about the Sudanese people, they would stop fighting and unite. They would unite against the invisible hand. They know the issues. They're all being heavily funded by outsiders with ulterior motives. And therefore, we end up with a proxy war in Sudan because the two generals are failing to realize that what they purport to be doing, which is trying to protect the people of Sudan, they're actually hurting them terribly by allowing themselves to be used as instruments of their own self-destruction. Understand the invisible hand that has forever been present, not only in Sudan, but all of Africa. Follow the guns, follow the money. You can get to the real issues where we can begin to turn Africa around. That is the problem. That is the challenge Africa is facing today. The invisible hand, the outsiders who have always had ulterior motives. As long as Africa is unstable, it allows them to continue to do their dirty work. It makes it easy for them to continue to exploit our continent. To our people on Africa Day, I say, understand Africa from the genesis of our issues that have been present ever since the invaders from the West came to Africa, descended upon us. Understand their agenda, understand where they are coming from, and refuse to be used as the instrument of your own self-destruction, which is what is happening in Africa today.
Well, thank you, Ambassador, for that wonderful message. That's the message. Also, Ambassador, the other issue that Africa is still grappling with is its lack of a proper representation globally, being heard regarding the deliberate lack of attention on the part of the international entities. For instance, Africa has no seat at the UN Security Council. It's not included in the G7 or in the G20. So Africa has been voicing its dismay for a long time now and will continue to do so. What prospects do you see here, Ambassador?
Well, I think people have to understand that the disunity and the disorganization that is Africa today is by design. Go back to the Berlin Conference. People must understand Berlin Conference, they met for 4 months to strategize and putting together a policy that was designed to see to it that Africa and her children are forever defeated and dominated. So as long as we are speaking as 55 little bitty African countries, we can never come out with a position that we can then demand that we must be the 6th member of the 5-member UN Security Council, that we must be the 21st member of the G21, that we must be the 8th member of the G7. As long as we are being told you have 55 different sovereign nations, we are fighting with one pinky finger when we could be fighting with 5 fingers and throw a sucker punch. What Africa needs to understand is that we need to speak with one voice. For example, let's take the UN. If the Africans were to say, United Nations, you are a totally useless organization, you are a toothless bulldog, there's nothing there for us, you are supposed to be the watchdog for all human rights violations, and yet 3 of the 5 members of the UN Security Council, they are very strongly guilty of slavery, crimes that they have never been charged for, crimes they are struggling to pay reparations for. How then do you, the United Nations, continue to have these 3 members of the UN Security Council who continue, 2 of them, I'm talking Britain, I'm talking France, they continue to have remains of our ancestors, physical bodies of our ancestors who they classified as trophies of conquest, and they refuse to return them because they are equivalent to an animal. Just like you went to Africa and you killed a lion, you equally killed a human being. That is your trophy. To this day, 2023, they are refusing to train them. Hello, Secretary Guterres, what are you doing? Let's look at the artifacts that were stolen, priceless. They all know where the artifacts came from. They are nicely displayed in the museum, showing what country they were stolen from, and nobody is talking about it. Again, Secretary Guterres, where are you? Let's talk about some of the basic egregious abuses of Africa. Let's look at the World Trade Organization. They are giving a blind eye. Look at Swiss coffee, Swiss chocolate, and yet we know all that chocolate is coming from West Africa. Switzerland does not have a single cocoa plantation. Where is the World Trade Organization? Why aren't you challenging them? It's been acceptable that Africa is supposed to produce and provide raw materials for the Western world. What Africa needs to do, for example, they could simply say, we are no longer going to attend the United Nations until we are 6th member of the UN Security Council. After all, African countries are the largest voting bloc at the United Nations. And instead, African countries are being used to vote on behalf of other countries on their agendas. You come, we give you a brown envelope, vote with us on our agenda. Africans must unite. If Africans were to speak with one voice and say, we will no longer be attending the United Nations, guess what? Things will change. It's these African countries, former colonies, if you were a British colony, if you were a German colony, French, Portugal, Belgium, if they were to say, as long as you are keeping the remains of our ancestors, we give you 2 weeks. All your citizens in our countries, if you do not return our ancestors, if you do not return our artifacts, your citizens have 2 weeks to get out of our countries. Guess what? It is those citizens who are going to be calling their countries and demanding that they return those remains. How long do you think a thumb of a British soldier lasts in Zimbabwe? How long do you think a finger of a German soldier lasts in Namibia? How long do you think a hand of a Portuguese soldier lasts in Namibia? Not even an hour. They will storm into those countries, murder thousands of people just to recover that tiny little body part. But when it comes to Africans, we are to blame because we are not complaining about it. We are not raising Cain. Our behavior as Africans when it comes to certain issues is not normal. It's abnormal. What is being done to us, we are not reacting like human beings. No, I am no longer going to the goddamn United Nations, pardon my language, until you fix this. There's serious crimes being committed on Africa, serious abuses, blatant abuses of Africa that are being ignored. So yes, it is a two-faceted approach. The United Nations must be held accountable for failure to deliver on their mandate. But we as Africans as well, we must stand up and say what's right is right, what is wrong, and hold the world accountable, and hold the Western world, and now the Eastern world accountable. Look at China, how they are blatantly abusing Africans. I was driving around the countryside 3 hours away from Harare yesterday. And there was this Chinese man nicely hugging and holding hands with a Zimbabwean girl. And I remember thinking, a Black African cannot do that in China. Those Chinese boys will kill him. Why is it that what is not right in their countries, we tolerate it in Africa? We too must behave like human beings. Whatever they would do to us in their countries, we will do to them in Africa. That is normal. We need to start behaving like human beings. The abuse that we are tolerating, we must no longer continue to tolerate it. We must push back, we must fight, and we must demand that we are treated respectfully and that what they want done unto them, they too must expect us to do the same. We can no longer continue to be abused and be slapped and turn the other cheek. Those days are over. Africans must behave like human beings. You punch me, I remember I'm going to share a joke with you. It's not a joke, but it is the truth. You know, if you punch me and I punch you right back, I can go to court and I win because it's reflex. That's just a human nature. It's a human response. But if you punch me and I stop and I pause and I think about it, then punch you, it's considered in a premeditation. The first response was a normal human response. We Africans are not behaving in a normal human way. You do not kill my ancestors, keep them, look me in the face and say, I'm not giving them to you. But guess what? I'm still coming to your house and I'm going to teach you about human rights. While you have the head of my ancestor and I entertain you and I listen to you talk to me about human rights and I don't challenge you about what you're doing, what's in your closet, It's insane, my son. What we do is ridiculous. It just doesn't make any sense. Why do we do this? I would not be dealing with any Europeans until all these remains are back. I would not be dealing with any Europeans until all the artifacts are back. Let's behave in a human way. I would not be going to the United Nations until Africa is part of the sixth member of the UN Security Council. And I like what, I think it was President of DRC, I can't remember. We need to have 2 seats at the UN Security Council. Let's make it a 7-member UN Security Council. Let's stand our positions, demand it, and say, we are walking out of the organization because it doesn't represent us. And until this organization is representing us, we are out. That is the normal thing to do. How bad do things have to get before Africans get really angry and say enough is enough?
Wow.
We need to get to that level. And for people to understand that, they must understand the genesis, they must understand the games that are being played on Africa. It's only Africans who can defend themselves against this abuse. And for us to do that and do it effectively, we must be armed with knowledge of what is really going on. Understand the hidden hand.
Wow, wow, what a message, Ambassador. We're running out of time and we have 2 minutes. So I really need your thoughts about what Ethiopia means to the OAU, to African nations as a seat of the OAU, and also as a nation propagating Pan-Africanism. So could you briefly tell us what Ethiopia is, when it comes to ideas of independence, Pan-Africanism, things like that?
Ethiopia marked the turning point in our journey to unite and someday look forward to an Africa that is united, a United States of Africa. That was a turning point. That's where the conversation began. We may still be struggling with those conversations. It's over 50 years since that conversation took place, but Ethiopia gave us the turning point and pointed us in the direction where we should be. So kudos to Emperor Haile Selassie. My only regret is that he is doing flips in his grave, him and the many other Pan-Africanists, particularly those who were members of the Casablanca group, who said Africa for the Africans, African Union now, and were willing to give up power for the sake of having a united Africa. I feel bad because we have not yet completed the unfinished business that they started. That I regret, and to them I apologize. As an elder, as an African elder, we must do better. We must make sure that what they started in Addis Ababa in 1963, May 25, that mission must be completed. We have a responsibility to do it for ourselves, for our children, and generations to come. Ethiopia, that is where the conversation began. That is where we were shown the pathway in a very laser beam focused way. This is the direction we needed to go. We have a long way to go, but Ethiopia paved the way for us. And for that, we will forever be grateful to Emperor Haile Selassie and the entire team of Pan-Africanists who met on that day in 1963, May 25th. We will forever be grateful for them, but we also apologize for not having completed the mission that they started.
Wow, Ambassador, thank you so much for your precious time and your precious ideas. I really, really appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for your time, and please keep up the good work.
Thank you, Ambassador. Well, dear viewers, that was Ambassador Arikana Chihombori-Quao, the former AU ambassador to the United States of America and the president and founder of Africa Diaspora Development Institute, talking to us on the 60th anniversary of the AU and other related issues. Thank you so much for having been with us so far. Until I see you next time with another program, it's goodbye from me, Shifara.